Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone, all four of you. But I think we have quite a few people online. So hi to everyone online. And thank you for coming. I know the school's kind of wrapping up. Since there's only 4 people here, we might go around and do a round of introductions.
Hi, I'm Lana. I actually know each other. I was supposed to come to New Zealand.
You were that Lana. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I mean, maybe we can see.
Yeah.
There's still an opportunity for you to come, but yeah, we've been closed like North Korea for the last 3 years. Nice to meet you, Lana.
Hi, my name is Bobby, and I'm really excited to be here. And it would also be really interesting to hear your personal stories about how you ended up in New Zealand.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Matta.
Hi, Matta.
I'm in my final year of PhD,
So you can read the line.
yeah,
And you're thinking about where you're going to end up. Okay,
that's quite very interesting.
that's it.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm also the last year for PhD. I don't see that in life.
Well, sometimes the line is the train, right?
Yeah. And I think it's really exciting to hear about your story, let's see, issues going down in here and so.
Okay. Well, nice to meet you all. And again, a big hello to everyone online. We're going to be recording this first session, the second bit. So this first bit is going to run for an hour from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Then we're going to have a wee break. And then the second bit is more interactive, and unfortunately, that's harder to do online. So we're going to talk a little bit about, some of you mentioned, I'm not that I like to talk about myself, but I will tell you a little bit about my journey because it's, it was very serendipitous, and I don't, sometimes I still have to pitch myself, how in the world did I end up at the end of the world, where New Zealand literally is. We could probably, to get you all ready for the international job market, we would need at least a week. So I'm saying this as a disclaimer. Hopefully this hour today provides some food for thought. Because I remember when I first went out overseas, this was 2010, and I was extremely lucky that Professor Raškovića at the Faculty of Social Sciences opened the door for me, and I ended up at Harvard. And I realized then how unprepared I was. When I gave my first presentation, it went horribly. Afterwards, it felt like I was in a boxing ring with Mike Tyson. And I just came home, I crawled up in bed, and like I spent a day in bed. I was like, this is the most horrible experience. And it's then that I realized that I think in Slovenia, because there isn't really a job market, it's quite a small kind of environment, and usually you get handpicked by the great powers, and then you start as a teaching assistant and so on. But those of you that are thinking and looking a bit more further afield, I think it's important to understand how to get ready and how to help yourself to get ready for the international job market. So we're going to just touch upon a few things. And obviously, different countries, different systems, different institutions, but there are some common touch points, and one of them is on research identity, right? That's something that people are looking at. Any kind of interview or hiring committee is looking to get a sense of who you are as a researcher, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about research identity. One of the most typical questions that people get asked is about research strategy. So what is actually research strategy? What are some of the key points of that research strategy? How do we articulate it in our job talk? We tend to focus so much on research, but usually most of academics are on a 40-40-20 model. 40% is teaching, 40% is research, and then 20% is community service. And we tend to forget or underestimate the teaching bit, which is particularly overseas extremely important because that's the cash cow for the universities, right? research is important, but it's the tuition fees overseas that really the big bucks. And universities abroad put a lot of emphasis on teaching philosophy, teaching approaches, how do you provide feedback, what kind of marking rubrics do you use, and so on. So it's important for us not to just kind of think, oh, I'm just going to read it and tell a few stories of my teaching, provide spectacular student feedback. And I'm going to kind of finish up with touching upon some of the what I call the golden rules of the academic job talk. And then after the break, we're going to try and get as much time as possible. Actually, give you the opportunity, because there's only 4 of you. I think we can, really make good progress. How do we start crafting our research strategy? Right? And hopefully we'll have enough time also at least get a head start on our teaching statement, right? Because very often when you're going to be applying for jobs, one of the things that you're going to be asked to provide is the teaching statement. And how do we actually write that first introductory paragraph that has all the important hooks? Okay, I'm just going to check if there are any. So if there are any comments or questions, please put them in the chat. I'm the world's worst multitasker, but I'll try to get to some of them. So a little bit about my background. I got my PhD at this University of Ljubljana, at the School of Economics and Business in 2012. It's been now 11 years since my PhD. And my PhD was on buyer-supplier relationships in multinational companies. Very kind of standard, run-of-the-mill international business PhD. I had the most incredible good fortune, and that is all that it was just pure luck, that one of the co-supervisors on my PhD was Professor Perrigo at the Faculty of Social Sciences. And as we were discussing, she said, okay, methodologically, there's about 5 people in the world that are really experts in what you want to do. Why don't you send them an email? Tell them that you're working with me, and let's see if any of them would like to host you. And 4 of them were in Europe, 1 of them was in the US, and it just happened that that person was at Harvard University, and long story short, I ended up there for a year in 2010, 2011. And I was hosted by the sociology department, which for me was an incredibly eye-opening experience, because it made me realize the differences between ontology, epistemology, different points of view. And my PhD took kind of a sociological turn. I still looked at buyer-supplier relationships, but I looked at more the soft stuff, the social mechanisms. And for me personally, that has been really beneficial to be, for a period of time, nestled or embedded in a different discipline than my own, to really understand what are some of the underlying assumptions of my discipline, the theories that I was using. I was born in Slovenia, but I actually come from a mixed family background, so Serbian and Slovenian background. Why am I emphasizing this? When you will be interviewing for jobs and positions at the university, you need to humanize yourself, right? You need to bring in your family history, your cultural history, because universities overseas, particularly North America, but say Australia and New Zealand, they are looking also for your soft skills, cross-cultural skills. So the fact that you might be bilingual or trilingual, the fact that you might be coming from a mixed family background, that all speaks to some of the soft skills that you might have that are really important, because the student body in other universities around the world is much more heterogeneous than it is here. Yes, here in Slovenia, we have Erasmus students that come from different parts of Europe, but overseas, you really have a greater degree of variety and heterogeneity. So my early career, after I got my PhD in 2012. I started as an assistant professor here at the School of Economics Business at Indiana University. As it happened, my supervisor at that time went to the university rectorate, to the deputy vice chancellor, and then also the minister of education. So what that meant was I was a young assistant professor and I had to step up and assume certain administrative roles that usually a junior scholar should not have assumed. And that was quite challenging for me, but I also learned a lot. And then 2017, I was again kind of nudged by Professor Pelli on the Faculty of Sciences. Why don't you apply for a Fulbright? And I thought it's really hard for someone with an economics background, business background, to get a Fulbright. They usually go for, hard sciences. But somehow we ended up making it work, and I went back to the US 2017 as a Fulbrighter again to sociology at Harvard. And I started doing research and teaching connected to China, so that led me to Shanghai's University of International Business and Economics in China and KU, National University in South Korea. So I tried to take any possible opportunity to go abroad. Maybe it's because of my background, international business. I felt like I had to walk the talk. And we're going to talk about this point of having skin in the game. It's really important that what you are researching, that you have some skin in the game in that subject matter. That helps you establish a certain degree of legitimacy and credibility in that area. And that helps you to then connect to your passion. Because when you will be going on the job market, what they're mainly looking for is also, yes, you need to have certain skills, right? They need to make sure that you are good at teaching, that you're good at research, but they're also looking for someone with passion. And that is quite important as well. So more recently, I moved to New Zealand in 2018. So I've been in New Zealand for a little over 5 years. I came into as a senior lecturer. So New Zealand has a British system: lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, and full professor. So it's kind of an additional level compared to here. And it's very, very different to North America, where you assistant professor, 6 years tenure, associate professor, and then full professor. So I spent some time as the director of learning and teaching in New Zealand, and a lot of people will discourage you from taking any kind of learning and teaching role. They will say, just focus on your research. Teaching doesn't matter. As long as you don't complain too much, you're fine. I would challenge that, right? I think it's really hard to burn out as a researcher. And I think it's where I feel my batteries. It's where I get my passion. It's also through teaching. I also then did a stint as executive MBA director, which again, so I try to take various roles because, especially as you will be progressing through your career, demonstrating that you have actually taken up leadership roles is very important. And I moved to Auckland University of Technology, or there's two missing, in 2022 and assumed the position of associate professor. For those of you that are interested in a little bit about my background story, I'm going to be sharing these slides with you, by the way. I wrote kind of a semi-academic piece that has a very kind of personal, reflective introduction. Welcome to have a read of it. So let's start with research identity, right? Who we are as researchers. And that's one of the things that is very important to articulate when you are applying for positions. For people to have a sense of who you are holistically, as a researcher? What are your theoretical toolkits? What kind of phenomena you're interested in? What motivates you? What drives you? And a good research identity starts with knowing who you are as a researcher, as a person. And it's here that it's important to understand and to convey your background, your personal history, right? So I remember when I was interviewing in New Zealand, one of the questions I got asked is, like, we've never heard of Slovenia, a tiny country, right? On the other side of the world, what makes you an expert in international business? And I said, well, in Slovenia, 90% of the GDP are exports. So in Slovenia, almost all business is international. And framing it that way and bringing in some of the personal context that obviously help. As you will later on see, I work a lot with social identity theory. And again, they were like, okay, so you use social identity theory, so what? I said, well, I grew up in a country that no longer exists. So I could see and experience firsthand what happens when they're trying to create a supranational identity and then it falls apart. So I try to connect it to my past, my life story, my background. And then actually you make it much more real, you make it much more credible. You're not just this researcher bot that uses social identity theory. So it's really, really important to humanize ourselves, because what they're also looking for is personality, and what they're looking for is how will you fit with their department. You can have all the A-star publications, but they say that the fit's not going to be there. Trust me, they will not hire you. And sometimes you can compensate a lot. Because if you're competing against PhD graduates from North America, their starting position is completely different than here. You can compensate a lot with personality and humanizing ourselves. So when we are articulating or where we get asked about our research identity, things to kind of keep in mind is obviously telling them about our interdisciplinary or disciplinary background. Making sure what you studied, majors, minors, double majors. Very often when you will be going up for roles, you will be competing with PhD graduates from North America that might have an undergraduate degree in engineering, and then they did their PhD in business or management or something like that, right? So it's very important to kind of show what your undergraduate degree was, postgraduate degree, and PhD. Obviously, now chances are that unless you're interviewing for a job in Zagreb or Belgrade or Trieste, when you say University of Ljubljana, a lot of them won't know where that is, right? So things to kind of invoke or mention in the university ranking. Right, those of you that are doing your PhD program here at the School of Economics and Business, it's a triple accredited business school, right? State, CSV, and MBank accredited, which is a seal of approval, but also university rankings on Times Higher Education and university and so on. Right? Country image does also play a role, and luckily Slovenia is becoming very widely known for Primož Roglič, for Luka Doncic, right? And any kind of relation that you can make to a positive country of image, that definitely helps. And I think that's something that really helps New Zealand PhD graduates. Right? New Zealand has an incredibly positive image. It's also very important, particularly in social sciences, to be clear about your philosophical stance. Are you a positivist? Are you a critical realist? Are you an interpretivist? Are you a constructivist? Right? Now, in natural sciences, obviously, natural sciences are more positivist in nature, but if you're coming from social sciences, be clear about what your philosophical stance is. It's also important to think about how you would describe yourself in one sentence. then think about how can that description help you differentiate yourself from others? Because if you say, so for example, Lana, what's your PhD on?
Well, I'm not sure yet, I'm just in my first year.
But like, I'm guessing you have some sort of.
Oh, I'm a lawyer otherwise, so I'm
Okay.
law and economics, so probably so we'll be sitting on. Now, we have the carrots and, the broad framework is the carrots and sticks framework,
Okay.
which is based on a rational choice for the existing literature.
Apply to what phenomenon, what.
So tax law, we can do that, and bringing in behavioral aspects. Okay.
So when you're kind of trying to describe yourself in a sentence, okay, you're law and economics, tax law, behavioral economics. And then once you put that on paper, you then need to start thinking about how will that differentiate you from other people. Will you be going up for roles that mostly economists want to apply? Then you want to amp up more the law economics space. But if there's going to be people from law and economics, you need to find an angle that you kind of differentiate yourself. Right? So here's just an example of the description that I use, right? When people ask me what do you do, particularly non-academic people, I say I'm an economic sociologist exploring international business phenomena at the intersection of global business, society, and policy. What's really important is that we understand that we don't live in this ivory tower. And I could very easily say, oh, I'm using this theory and that and so on, but we need to show that what we're doing matters beyond a small group of people that are doing research in that area. And for me, kind of the key distinguishing bit is economic sociologist. A lot of people don't really know what it is. Right? Are you an economist? Are you a sociologist? What is this thing? So they might be prompted to ask you a question, but that for me is kind of the differentiating. Right? So if I would be applying for more kind of sociological positions, I would say, well, as an economist, I can approach problem or phenomena from a kind of an economic point of view. What's really important is to also provide a sense of your values. What's really important to you as a researcher, and for me, a very important aspect in terms of my values as a research identity is that it makes it of relevance to a broader society. That it's not something that only 5 people or 20 people in the world are interested in. Articulating your theoretical toolkits, right? So particularly those of you that are towards the end of your PhD, I'm guessing you would be able to see what's your go-to theory, which is the main theory that you're using in your research.
That's a question, because my research is kind of two parallel researches going on. So one is more, I'm coming from humanities and linguistics. So one part is I'm trying to improve over the existing dictionary. So one part was more sociological, behavioral, maybe even. We're trying to establish what do users of the dictionary actually would like to happen. And the other part is more, well, maybe theoretical, let's say for lay people who are not from the.
So let's focus on the theoretical. What's the theoretical framework or the theoretical model?
Emerging over the existing dictionaries, databases, data in general.
But what's the underlying theory?
The underlying theory is researching synonymy. So data.
So that
I should have started with that.
So that's the thing, right? When we're talking about theoretical toolkits, it's being very, very precise. Because probably you're going to be applying for a role, people on the panel, they will all be in some way experts on linguistics. So you can skip that first bit, and you can just say, okay, if I have 15 seconds, how do I make the most out of that? I'm using synonyms. Synonym, right? So my go-to theory is synonym. And when people ask me, what kind of research I do, I say I look at IV phenomenon mostly from a social academic theory lens. That's my go-to theory. I also use socio-cognitive theory and institutional theory. So when we're talking about our theoretical toolkits and the theories that we're using, being very clear that we're talking about a theory or a set of theories. And then comes the phenomenon, right? And you said dictionaries, how do people use dictionaries and so on, right? I would start with theoretical toolkits first, and then say I'm using this theory and I'm applying it to dictionary use, for example. Now, depending on if your PhD is really methodologically hardcore and you're using different methods, or if your contribution in terms of the research that you're doing is heavily on the methodological side, right? You might be doing some interesting kind of methodological approach. I don't know, using eye tracking, how people handle a dictionary or something like that. Then you might want to provide some additional information on methodological approaches, level of analyses, right? And supervisors or affiliations, yes, if that makes sense, right? If you're applying for a job in Canada and your supervisor is not worldwide known, then it doesn't really make sense, to be emphasizing that. But if your supervisor is one of the leading experts in the field, by all means, right? Let's do that as well. What I've learned since graduating here is that I used to write on my CV as like a phone book, whole bunch of information. And I realized that your CV actually needs to have a story. There needs to be a narrative to your CV. It's actually an opportunity for you to tell your story and to showcase your research in an interview. And what I usually do, and this was heavily recommended by several North American colleagues, is at the beginning, I include one paragraph. It's like kind of an executive summary. Right? CVs can be several pages long. And at the beginning, I have this one paragraph that kind of summarizes who I am and what I am about. Right? That includes, obviously, as you progress through your academic career, it may include certain leadership roles and certain leadership positions, right? But also bringing things, right? Bridging international business strategy and economic sociology through interdisciplinary research using social identity theory, socio-cognitive theory, and institutional theory, right? Making sure that you emphasize the theoretical toolkit and the phenomenon that you are interested in. Do not forget, always finish with a sentence or two on your pedagogical philosophy, unless you're going to be going up for a research organization, right? So, for example, I was emphasizing my experience in Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America, and I finished off with a sentence: "My learning and teaching philosophy is inspired by Albert Einstein's philosophy, passion and curiosity." Right? I try to make students more curious.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Thank you very much. Yes. It's a good question. It depends from one discipline to the other, obviously. But I think part of any kind of research identity, you should be able to articulate either a theoretical area, right? For example, in economics, Lara says behavioral economics, right? At least a certain theoretical domain, if not a specific theory, right? But research identity should provide enough understanding, because people need to understand what are your go-to theories, because a theory is like a tool. So if you have a hammer, you're gonna be looking for nails to hammer them in. If you have a knife, you're gonna be looking at stuff that you can kind of slice open, right? So in certain disciplines and certain areas, you might not be able to pinpoint it to a specific theory, like I said, social identity theory, but in the case of Lana, I'd say, okay, behavioral economics, it can be some sort of theoretical domain, right? If you're doing a PhD in chemistry, making sure that it's organic or inorganic chemistry. If you're doing in humanities, linguistics, and then I'm guessing there different subjects, linguistics. It is important to provide as much precision as possible on that. Okay. And as I have said, once you've articulated your research identity, then you need to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the interview panel. And you need to think, if they're going to have 5 people that they shortlisted, what makes you stand out? How are you different? Right? So it's not just about showing who you are, it's about standing out from the crowd, being different, being unique. And I think very often, and I had this challenge when I was a PhD student, I wanted to show I'm good enough. And I realized that what's important is, yes, you need to show that you have certain credentials, that you have certain skills, and that you have certain merits. But at the end of the day, the decision is going to be made by people talking around the table, and they will also go by their gut feeling, right? They will say, okay, I think this person would be a good fit for the department. So in terms of, so this is a little bit on research identity, but one thing, to get us thinking is, how will we articulate a research identity? And in our CV, the first paragraph, that's the opportunity to kind of provide a summary of that research identity. Now, when it comes to research strategy, right? Very often, when PhD students get asked, and I've recently helped a recent PhD graduate here from the School of Economics and Business, as they were applying for their first position in the UK. And they said to me, what's a research strategy? Right? And I said, what did you answer? And they said, well, I just said, oh, I want to get promoted to assistant professor and then associate, right? And that's not a research strategy. So a research strategy kind of has 4 components: objectives, goals, strategies, and measures. And the objective is kind of your vision or your aspiration of who do you want to become as an academic, right? And what kind of impact do you want to make? Universities nowadays, it's all about impact, particularly in business management, economics, social sciences, right? So research strategy and crafting that kind of aspirational objective, where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years' time, gives you the opportunity to showcase, what do you do, why does it matter, to who does it matter? In terms of research strategy, you need to talk about the journals that you're going to be targeting, the journals that you publish, the journals that you're kind of going to be targeting, and it's here that you need to do your research to understand what rankings do the university that you're applying for are they using. Research domains, right? So linguistics, behavioral economics, these are what area are your research in?
Well, I'm also in first year, okay, at Fauna, and I'm still working on it, but the wider area is sustainability in B2B marketing.
Okay.
And I would like to connect it to the strategies of digital marketing, how digital marketing can influence the sustainability engagement for B2B companies. So it's
okay. So You're highlighting already a couple of domains, right? The larger domain is kind of sustainability in the B2B marketing. And then the interesting bit is the digital, right?
Yeah.
Because with things like sustainability or diversity, equity, or inclusion, or there are certain topics that are now very in. And I don't know if it ever happened to you, but when I was doing my research and as a buyer-supplier relationships, like people started rolling their eyes and they said, "Oh, there's been 1,000 papers written on it, right? But possibly could be, right? That means sustainability. There is the danger of someone saying, "Oh, what possibly can you add? There's been sustainability, right?" So the digital angle is kind of what makes it interesting. Universities abroad focus more widely than on just journals and manuscripts. Research funding is incredibly important. Showing that you are aware of what are the most important sources of funding, what are the most important agencies, and that you are thinking and that you are working towards those funding sources is incredibly important, right? They are hiring you not just for the current skills, but also the potential. And by clearly saying that, I don't know, in 3 years, I'm planning to apply for an ERC grant or Marie Curie or Fulbright, whatever, you're kind of already signaling that you understand that there's more to research than just publishing academic journals. And don't forget about your community, right? How are you planning to serve your community? Which are the main organizations within your field? For example, in international business, that would be the Academy of International Business. If you're more in the marketing area, I'm guessing AMA, the American Marketing Academy, right? So in terms of your research strategy, go beyond just the journals, consider funding, signal your intention or your aspirations for specific funding, and also how are you planning on getting involved in the various special business groups within your areas. If your organizations or associations that you're part of have chapters, regional chapters or geographic chapters, or special interest groups. And then in terms of the steps, right? Being very clear, what I noticed is that I did the same thing, is I never put any papers that I'm currently working on in my CV. I just put the published papers. And even if you just have an idea, right, put it under research in pipeline. If you have something that's under review, even if it's just submitted, put it in there, right? Everything but the kitchen sink. Especially if you're an early career researcher, if you're a PhD student going out on the job market, you won't have 20 different publications, right? But you are going also with the potential and the promise, and you need to provide an idea to the panel what you're working on, what you're interested in. You can even have a special section on projects that I'm planning on working in the next 3 years. That's all part of your research strategy. And you also need to demonstrate that you're able to speak the language, that you understand the rankings of the journals, right? So that you understand that you have done your research in terms of promotion criteria, right? If university that you're applying to put a huge emphasis on funding, and if your research strategy doesn't include a single sentence or a single plan on funding, you will already be immediately disadvantaged, right? So you need to understand the system, also the promotional system at the university that you are applying at. And in reality, right, and if you look at anyone's CV, including my own, right, that was the strategy, but that was the reality. And sometimes, particularly if you are doing your PhD in Slovenia, you have to do a lot of teaching. You're really a teaching assistant. There might not be that many courses that you're taking, so it's more kind of individual work with your supervisor. And let's be honest, and this was the same with me, you need to grab every low-hanging fruit there is. Publishing, attending a conference in Split or Rijeka or Zagreb that maybe someone in Canada never heard of. Right? That is fine as long as we're able to explain it. And when I was being interviewed for a role, they did ask me about this, and I said, look, I was a teaching assistant. I had 25 contact hours per week. And then once they understood the system here, they said, oh, actually, you managed to do quite a lot. Like your research is actually, it's solid for the amount of teaching and marking that you had to do. Right? So it's completely fine to understand that, in life, many things happen. Family, kids, illness, different issues, and by humanizing ourselves and acknowledging that, not pretending that it doesn't exist, we can actually turn it into a positive. So in my case, one of the reasons that they hired me was they said, okay, we could see that you've done a lot of teaching. Where I think, how many of you are teaching assistants? Okay, so those of you that are teaching assistants, you already have an incredible advantage when it comes to pedagogy, right? You've tried things, you've failed in the classroom, you know what the challenges are, you understand the students. Leverage that in your CV, leverage that in your teaching statement as well. Because a lot of the time, particularly in North America, PhD students focus just on the research and on publishing papers. And one of the things that I was really surprised at is when I was at Harvard, I saw how ill-equipped they were to present their research. Their research was spectacular. They had fantastic knowledge of theory and of the literature, because all they did for 4 years was read papers to discuss them. But when it came to standing in front of people and selling your research, I realized that whoever is coming from this environment, 10 hours of teaching per week or so on, has a comparative advantage. Now, in terms of research, right, we said there's a shift towards impact and relevance, because for a long time academia has been kind of locked up in an ivory tower. It's important to also understand that your research should matter for people beyond your discipline area or your wider community. Right? So there's a difference between something that's interesting and something that is important. And when we're thinking about the research that we're doing, we should ask ourselves, why is it important and to whom is it important? Who are the key stakeholders? It's also important to understand that you need to have agency as a PhD student, not just to blindly play the game. And I'll give you one example, right? How many of your supervisors you should publish, A-star journals, right? And it's very easy to say that because you are putting everything on the line, you're risking everything. You can work on an A-star application for 2 to 3 years, it gets rejected, and then you have nothing, right? So it's important, I'm not saying don't listen to your supervisor, but what I'm saying is have some agency.
This is plan A.
Yeah.
Plan B is publish matter.
So there might be different strategies. One strategy is shoot for an A-star, get good feedback, and then if it doesn't go through, put it in an A. Or as you mentioned, and that's something that I use, first, try to figure out the minimal criteria, right? And then you have an additional pet project if you want to work. The key thing is you need to define also your own measure of success. Because burning out and having a nervous breakdown, even if you're able to get that A-star publication, it's not worth it, right? You're going to be in this business, in this industry for decades. You need to make sure that you're able to to sustain the trajectory that you are and sell yourself or your soul to the devil. One thing that I always advise my PhD candidates is, if your supervisor is telling you go for an A star and they don't have an A star, then you shouldn't take them serious. Because as a supervisor, you know, you have what, a 1 hour meeting maybe once a week if you're lucky. It's very easy to say, you know, you should go for the American Journal of Economics. And then I look away and you're like biting your nails. How am I going to be able to do that? Where maybe like nobody from Slovenia ever published, right? So whoever is giving you advice, I always ask myself, do they have skin in the game? Have they actually met those very same criteria? Now, as someone that is sociologically inclined and works with social identity theory, this is something that I'm increasingly mindful of. Avoiding the trap of comparing yourself to others, right? Particularly at overseas universities, right? If you have a very recognized supervisor at Harvard or MIT or Stanford, your starting point is completely different than someone that's doing their PhD here, right? So you need to make sure that you are, if you are comparing yourself, that you're comparing apples to apples and pears to pears. And try to be the best you can, so you're competing with yourself. Don't go down the rabbit hole of social comparison with others. Remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You have so many people that, you know, completely put their life on hold just to get those A-star publications, right? And I've seen so many of them burn out, have health issues, or become so embittered about the process. But at the end of the day, nobody's going to be in academia for the money, right? So you need to nurture your passion. You need to make sure that what you're doing also is fulfilling and it makes sense to you, and that it will sustain you for 30, 40, or even more years. It's also important not to become what we would call in German Fachidiot, right? And you would be surprised at how many academics are world-class experts in their field, but they've never gone to an art exhibition, they've never gone to theater, they live in their tiny little world, and they don't interact with others. And a lot of overseas universities are very market-oriented. Now in New Zealand, at AUT, we're going through our 4th financial restructuring. So because of COVID, tuition fees went down. Universities, one of the first things they do, they start downsizing, they start firing people. And it's been heartbreaking to see people who have invested their whole life into their academic career, and all of a sudden the university lets them go. And they have no idea what they're going to do with their lives, right? So it is just a job at the end of the day, and we need to make sure that we have social support system, that we are humans outside of work. Do the things that you feel comfortable with, right? If it doesn't feel right that somebody should have their name on the paper just so that your paper gets published, then be vocal about that, right? Don't feel like you have to sell your soul to the devil just to reach and get those milestones. And particularly if you are a female academic, unfortunately, there's quite a bit of sleazy older male academics that are willing to help you, but God knows what they're expecting from that, right? At the end of the day, it is your PhD, it is your research, it is your integrity. You should be able to sleep at night. And if it doesn't feel right, if you don't feel comfortable with it, don't be afraid to stand up for it. And as I said, do not forget about teaching, right? Your typical academic role, if you're going in as an assistant professor, will probably be 40-40-20. 40% teaching, 40% research, 20% service. You take on some sort of undergraduate program coordinator, or you are a member of the ethics committee at the university, and so on. When it comes to teaching, they will always ask you, what is your teaching philosophy? And you need to start thinking, how would you articulate a teaching philosophy that doesn't require 2 pages to explain? Something that is easy to grasp, something that is memorable. And for me, it's been this idea about passionate curiosity, trying to make students more curious and more passionate about things. So I start my lectures always with current news. It's something that's currently going on in the local environment globally. I start getting them talking, and then kind of zoom out and then say, okay, theoretically, this is actually this theory with that model, and so on. Right? Trying to get them first interested and engaged. It's worthwhile to read up a little bit on different teaching approaches and teaching philosophies. And what I've learned is that I was doing things just kind of intuitively for trial and error as a teaching assistant, teaching for 25 hours per week for years and years and years. And I didn't know how to call it. So reading up on some of the key terms and around teaching philosophies, like very often you will be asked to demonstrate how you are using learner-centered pedagogy. And what that basically means is how you are not just talking at people, but how you're actually trying to understand who the student is, who the learner is, what they need, what motivates them, and so on. So this learner-centered pedagogy and approaches is a very kind of fashionable concept, an important concept to grasp. Problem-based learning, particularly in business, I try to use a lot of case studies. That's problem-based learning. You give them a problem. You're working with real companies on consultancy projects. Storytelling. I'm a huge proponent of storytelling. Trying to teach them through story. And luckily, I think one of the things that I have been told the reason why I can be hired is because of my diverse international experience background. And I bring all of that into the classroom. And I use my own experience from my career or my personal life in the classroom. And when you start telling stories, people connect, people emphasize, people remember. Right? Key things to be mindful and articulate clearly. Right? One of the things that you will probably ask is, how does your research inform your pedagogy? And that's something that we usually don't think about, right? We have one area of school research, another one is school pedagogy, particularly here in Slovenia. You might be teaching one course that has nothing to do with your research. Huh? Be clear to provide information on the type of courses you have taught. Undergraduate, postgraduate, first year, second year, third year courses, how big were the classrooms, how diverse were the classrooms. Right? So one of the things that I mentioned in my job interview was I said, you know, most universities in the West have very diverse student bodies, but when you come into the classroom, it's like 40% are Chinese, 30% are Indian, and then the rest is a little bit scattered. Here in Slovenia, this heterogeneity is much more. Right? You've got 2 Spanish, 1 Portuguese, 1 from Kazakhstan, and so on, at least here at the Faculty of Economics. So don't assume that they will actually understand the sizes of the classrooms and things like, you know, diversity, background knowledge, and so on. Right? Were you instructing in English language? And that's something that's really important to highlight. Provide student evaluations. either through a formal evaluation process or qualitative feedback informally. You can always ask a class representative or a student association organization to provide some sort of statement, qualitative feedback. Right? Any kind of demonstration of student feedback is a necessary part of talking about your teaching. Demonstrate teaching innovation. What the committees are looking at, especially post-COVID-19, is how open, because let's be honest, senior academics, they like to do their own thing and they're not the most innovative bunch. Right? So when the university decides to switch from Blackboard to Canvas, it's always the senior academic that can't be bothered to learn the management system. And I think it's really here that you're able to demonstrate a comparative advantage. If you have been using Padlet, if you've been using Mentimeter, if you've been using this or that, apps, software, anything that is innovative. If you've been using Instagram as a way to do market analysis. So one of the things that they're really looking at is teaching and innovation, any kind of way of demonstrating anything innovative that you've done in your teaching, study tours, trips, and so on. If you've undergone any special pedagogy training, anything that you can put on your CV, including the thing that we're doing today, mention that, right? That will demonstrate your commitment to pedagogy, that will demonstrate the skills and interests. Okay, 3 golden rules. So we're going to be maybe 2 minutes over time. Please forgive. So the first golden rule is do your homework. When I was applying for my first position in New Zealand, it took me about a week of preparation for that interview. Right. So what you want to do is you want to carefully study the role description. And most overseas universities will have very clearly defined roles. They will also mention specific criteria. So study the role description carefully. You also don't have to be too critical of yourself in a sense. They list 8 criteria and you meet 7 but not 8. Right? You don't have to meet every single criteria to apply for a job. Your PhD might be in management, but you're applying for teaching management. Like your PhD might be on law and economics, but you're applying for strategic management position. Right? So when universities publish role descriptions, it's like a wish list, Christmas list to Santa Claus. This is what our ideal candidate will look like. And don't be too critical of yourself. Of course, you need to meet most of the criteria, but if you don't meet one or a couple, that's fine too. Do a lot of background research on your panel. Where they're from, culturally, where they have studied, what their career was. Because you need to connect with the panel. You need to understand where the panel is coming from. At the end, it's not going to be ChatGPT making the decision. It's going to be human beings, and we need to connect with them. I remember when I first came to New Zealand in 2018, and I had a 1-hour interview with my head of school. I walked into her office, and she was standing like this. I looked at her feet, and I said, "You're a dancer." And we spent 35 minutes talking about dancing, small talk, before we actually got down to business. But it was that connection, right? Trying to find a connection, humanizing yourself, that was, I think, instrumental in some way. You will be hired, and you will be with the department. It's really important for you to understand the department, how big it is, who are the people in the department, gender composition, ethnic composition, right? Because at the end of the day, it is how well you will fit in the department, with the department. not just all the exam education that you have. Do your research on institutional philosophy. So if you're applying for a job at Harvard, you better be really, really good at study teaching, because that's their only instruction method at the business school. So you don't want to say, well, I'm not a big fan of cases, and you apply to Harvard Business School. You want to be sure of this, right? Understand what the philosophy is. You don't want to have a generic application and then just change the name, right, from Dear Smita to Dear Paul, and the rest is the same. It shows whether you have a cookie cutter generic application. Invest the time to tailor-made it specifically. Right? So understand your audience, be professional and structured. Once you've done it, sleep on it, come back the next morning with a fresh pair of eyes. Right? What I usually do is I take a lot of the concepts and the buzzwords from the job description and I incorporate them in my cover letter, in my statement. Right? Seek peer feedback. Ask people to provide feedback on your cover letter or your CV. Right? I remember the first time I made my CV and I sent it to a friend in the US. By the time I got it back, I couldn't recognize that was me. Right? So I know, sometimes you think you might be competing with other people, but then seek feedback and developmental feedback from people that you know are not going to be applied. Practice your interview. Fit and personality. This is probably the most important bit. It's not just your competence, it's how well you will fit within the department. That's the number one distinguishing factor. What do you bring into the table as a person? Family history, cultural background, life experience, travel experience, right? Slovenians, people that live in this part of the world, they usually speak at least 3 foreign languages. They usually traveled all over the world, right? So your typical Slovenian speaks at least 3 foreign languages and is probably reaching 40+ countries. Mention that because if you're going to be going on the job market, someone in New Zealand, maybe they've been to Australia. They speak English. That's their only mother tongue. Potential counts more as an accomplishment, particularly when you're going on the job. Don't be too hard on yourself. Nobody's expecting a PhD graduate to have 5 A stars. Show the potential, research that you have in the pipeline, research that you've started, research that you have under review, ideas that you always wanted to do but haven't actually started doing them. Demonstrate skill in the game. If you are doing research on linguistics, try to make it somehow relevant and show why is that of interest to you, right? If there's something around your background, like why are you doing research on linguistics? Right? It's very important to also ask follow-up questions at the interview. Things like, what is the culture at the department like? So it's here that you also show how you will engage as a member of that department. The worst thing you could do is being asked, do you have any questions for us? And you're like, no, I think I'm fine. But you already found yourself in the group. Okay, so this is it for the first bit. I'll just check if there's any questions or comments. No, just that one. Are there any questions so far on what we've discussed? So I know I've thrown a whole bunch of things at you, but hopefully some of these things will get you started thinking. Okay, chat. Thanks for the talk. Thank you, I appreciate it, right? So this has been more of a food for thought 1 hour crash course, but hopefully now you will at least be aware of some of the things that you need to focus on when you are thinking of going to the job.
Yeah, I have one short question. when would you advise to start looking for your next position? Like, for instance, I am a young researcher
Yeah,
for 4 years of what they say again. And what would you advise to begin?
it depends what your targeted geographical markets are and what the academic system there is. I would say don't start now. Usually it's about up to a year before you graduate. That would be the time that you would, especially if you're going for North American academic markets or Anglosphere markets, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, UK. They usually have hiring cycles. They usually start, I mean, in the US, would start sometime in late winter, early spring, and then it would finish around late spring or something like that. 12 months in advance, that's not a general policy.
And that would be totally normal for a potential employer to have a third-year PhD student, like already.
Yeah. I mean, so particularly in North America, they will be hiring now. So I just provided, I was helping a PhD student that's applying for an assistant professor position, starting date July 1st, 2024. So that's more than a year from now. Right, so most of the universities overseas are hiring a year in advance, or at least half a year in advance. And in the job description, in the role description, it will say you have a PhD in this and this area, or will have completed your PhD by this. Okay, we have another chat. Yes, the slides will be made available, so I'm going to send them to and they will distribute it. This is being recorded. I'm not sure what they're going to do with the recording, but yes, it's being recorded. So you will get the materials and hopefully also be able to access the recording. Okay, there are no. There's one more. So if there are no more other questions, I think let's do a 10-minute break, toilet break. And please come back 25. And thank you to everyone online. I hope this was useful to you. And as I've said, the slides will be made available to you, and this has also been recorded. Have a good day. And I'll stop recording now.